All right. Good evening. It's that time of year where we just finished the fall festival, so every lesson for the next 3 weeks has to start with, you know it? Thank you for taking part in the fall festival. Dad echoed the sentiment. Tommy read the letter from Tim this morning, and now it's my turn, and it probably can't be said enough. I am so grateful for what everyone did to be a part of that. It's a big event with a lot of moving pieces, but it's an important event because there is a sense in which it makes us visible. There's something about a church building in Texas that's not very visible. Do you know what I mean? There's one all over the place. And this event is something that makes the church, the love we have for each other, the care we have for others in the community, visible. It's a tangible thing that shows these invisible characteristics of us as God's people. And doing that yesterday, and then sleeping really hard last night, was part of the kingdom work. We don't know what fruit will come from this, but like we prayed for leading up to it, God can do big things with little people. And we did our little part yesterday, and now God is going to give the increase as he sees fit. So keep praying that the things that were done yesterday, the efforts that were put in are going to have their fruit shown in other ways. We met a lot of people. We were able to love on a lot of people, and it was a great event, and thank you for being a part of that. So about tradition, two things about sermon titles. One, I hate them because I always come up with good ones well after the fact. Two, I know that Dad is going to say them on Sunday morning. And as I was thinking about the lesson, I thought, well, we're going to talk about tradition, and I can't think of anything clever, so I'm going to call the lesson Tradition. And then I thought, how is Dad going to say that in his lesson? He's going to say, Joseph is talking about tradition. And then I thought, I'm just going to say that, about tradition. So that's the lesson tonight, about tradition, about that, all right? This is a subject that I think most of you probably have a feel for the way we're going to go with it tonight. When we talk about tradition in the church, often there are things like questioning tradition, challenging tradition, right? And I'm probably one of the people guiltiest of this. Why are we doing that way? Do we have to do it that way? Is this something that's in the Bible, or is this something that's a tradition? And when we look at tradition that way, that's I would say the most common way that we look at tradition, and it ends up being a bad thing. Tradition is kind of a bad word, right? We're not supposed to do the traditions. We're supposed to do what the Bible says, and those are often set in opposition to one another, whether they should be entirely or not, right? But that's kind of the way that we think about tradition. I want to throw this classic preacher story out at you about a family that had dinner on Sunday afternoons. And as long as they could remember, the lady who prepared the roast would cut off the ends of the roast and put the roast in the oven, right? And then they'd pull the roast out and they'd have dinner. And one day, one of the younger girls was learning to make it, and she said, hey, Grandma, why do you cut the ends off of the roast? She says, well, that's the way my mom taught me to do it. And then they got to thinking. They went and asked, or she asked her mom, and her mom said, that's the way my mom taught me to do it. So then they went and asked Grandma, and they said, Grandma, why'd you teach us to do this way? And she said, well, that's the way my mom taught me to do it. Through some investigation and understanding, they've got all the way back to the original roast maker, which is a cool title. And they determined that the reason that the ends of the roast were cut off was because she didn't have a pot that would fit a whole roast. So she had to cut the ends off to fit it in the pot, to fit it in the oven, right? And that got passed down. And they were throwing away perfectly good beef for years, which is the real sad part of the story. This is often a story like this. This is a classic preacher story to illustrate how tradition is not always a good thing. It's not a good thing to just cut off the roast mindlessly and waste when there's no reason to do that. And so we challenge our traditions. We say, is this thing that we do in the Bible, or are we cutting off the end of the roast? Okay? I want to make a distinction, though, as we jump in, between tradition and traditionalism. And I mean, technically, those are kind of the same thing, so go with me for tonight. I heard a preacher say that tradition is the living faith of the dead, but traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. The idea here is that these, in practice, are two different things. When you have a long-standing tradition, there is an element of tradition that is, hey, I did it this way because they've been doing it this way, and that's a cool, good thing. But then what we often just refer to in the blanket sense as tradition, traditionalism is the thoughtless, mindless, repetitive doing of a thing because it's the phrase, here's the phrase you were all waiting for, way we've always done it. Traditionalism. It's no longer something living and active and powerful and meaningful. It's something that is dead. It's the dead faith of the people who are still going through those motions. Right? And so you've got really two separate things here. You've got traditionalism, which is the bad use of the phrase, and you've got tradition, which can be meaningful for sure. All right. So if traditionalism is bad, then what is the right way to have or to observe tradition? By the way, if that word starts to just sound like a sound to you, it's called semantic satiation, which is an exciting thing to know. It's when that word just kind of does it, like it doesn't sound like the word anymore, it just sounds like the sounds. That's been my experience for the last week, thinking about the word tradition. But when you talk about tradition, what is tradition meant to be? What's it meant to look like? How do we do this in a way that is not the dead faith of the living, but the living faith of the dead? I think that there are, preacher, whatever, I have to have 3 points. So I tried to spread it, I tried to do more, and then I kept over-categorizing. 3 things, I think, make a tradition what it's meant to be, okay? The first one, if we are going to do tradition the right way, or if we're going to have tradition fully realized, is it has to have an element of retelling. You have to retell what you're doing, right? Sometimes we do things and we just don't tell anyone why we do them. And that turns into going through the motions. If you're going to do tradition well, if you're going to have traditions that are meaningful and powerful and impactful, you have to retell the things that you do or the things that you've done. I thought a great example of this recently was, Dad referenced it this morning, the lesson that Marcus Sanders presented. Was that last week? Has it only been 1 week? Oh, my word. That's the Fall Festival effect. All right, so he basically, in his lesson, told his story. He just told his life's story from knowing about his mom's God to being interested in this God to being found by this God through his people and to being committed to this God. Right? It was a really, really beautiful story. And he told the story, right? He because of the way that he retold it, his retelling allowed all of us to see something that God did in the world, in the life of another person, and many other people after that, depending on who Marcus gets to come into contact with. In fact, dare I say, Marcus's retelling impacted our lives, which means what happened to Marcus had reach into each and every person who was here and able to listen to him because of retelling. And so if we're going to have traditions, if we're going to do tradition the right way, it has to have an element of retelling. We've got to tell what we're doing, why we're doing it. Secondly, if traditions are going to be done the right way, and this is the one that I had the hardest time articulating, but if traditions are going to be done the right way, they have to have an element of reliving the experience, okay? I wanted to say remembering, but I thought that was a piece of reliving. An example I think that is not a positive thing, but a visceral example of this is a girl Courtney goes to book club / Bible study / girls night with. They had this girls night book club Bible study thing that they all did, and they were all good friends, and one person started inviting a lot of new people, and there were new people coming every week. Well, this one girl, her name was Stephanie, ended up having to stop coming. She quit coming, and it was because there were new people coming every week. But here's the part that made sense, okay? She didn't just dislike new people. She has a child who, as far as I understand it, still has cancer. And so her family is experiencing that every day. It's at the forefront of their minds. They've had good times. They've had much, much worse times. And so she'd make a comment with an understanding that her friends knew about her situation with her son. And then as the new people came, they kept asking the same question. And so she told one of the girls that hosts it, she said, listen, I just can't come anymore. I can't keep reliving that. Can't keep reliving. There is something about retelling our story. There's something about tradition that allows you to relive the experience. And it's more than just rote remembering. Like, hey, I remember that time when, right? But there are things, and there are ways in which you can remember that they stir something up inside of you. Have you ever stepped into maybe a childhood campground and you just smelled the cabin and immediately you were 15 and messing around in the cabin? Like, have you ever gone back to a childhood home and you stepped on that one floorboard and you knew that's the one that always made the noise? And it did. It made the noise, and it just put you right back where. There is something about tradition that has this unique ability to give you the sense of reliving what you have done in the past. When it's done well, when it's done right, tradition allows you to relive these things. A silly example, my family, we have a tradition. We call it the Sonic Night or the Sonic Feast. Our first Christmas with Bonnie, so we new parents with a 6-month-old baby. Here's the thing. Normally, if you're normal and your parents live in different cities, you do one family one year and the other family the next year, right? That's how normal people do this. We didn't have kids and we didn't care about driving, so we've just done both families both years. We just do a little longer in one place than the other, and we still keep that tradition to this day. But this particular year, 2019, we were driving back on Christmas night, and we were starving. And we wanted to kill each other because we were starving, and we were in the car, and we had a crying baby in the back seat. And we pulled in, she's looking up where's open, and we pull into the Macaroni Grill because it's the only place open. And we go up to the hostess, and she says, yeah, but it's a 2-hour wait. And we were like calculating, like, what time would we be home? Okay, that's not going to work. And then we saw that there were a couple chairs open in the bar area, and we're like, is it open seating? Could we get in quickly? Could we get our food and get home? And she said yes, so we went and sat down, and server came over and said, hey, what's going on? And we said, how fast can we have food? And she said 3.5 hours. The kitchen wait is 3.5 hours. And we said, well, that would put us home at 3 a.m. I don't think we're going to be able to, right? And so we go out to the car thinking, we're just going to fast on Christmas night because we were starving, and one of us might not make it. And then we saw that Sonic was open, so we pulled off the road and we pulled into Sonic, and they had a 30-minute wait. That was it. And we thought, how great. We could do 30 minutes. So we pulled the crying baby out of the car seat. We turned on a Mavs game on my phone, and we let her crawl all over the dashboard and steer the steering wheel and push buttons. And we had some music on, and we had a Sonic feast because I told you we were hungry, so we got way too much food. We've done that now every year. When we're traveling, not necessarily on Christmas night, we do Sonic feast. And the first couple of years, Bonnie didn't care, right? Because she was just kind of gnawing on French fries. But now Bonnie cares. And Moses cares. Because you know what they get? They get a slushie with nerds in it at Sonic Feast. And that's the greatest thing in the world. All right? And it's kind of a fun little tradition. We get to reenact that night, relive that night when, man, we were starving and then Sonic was the best food we'd ever eaten in our life. Which objectively it's not, but it was. You get what I'm saying? That we get to relive that. All right. And then the last one is reenacting. When tradition is done well, there is an involvement of your hands. There's something that you do that brings back to life these things that you have done. You are reenacting something you've done. It's not an official tradition. It's not. But I'm trying to make it one, and I say it low-key to a bunch of you every year that we do it. When Youth Camp happens, what do? We move chairs. Now, for those of you who are newish, you don't remember the days, but there were days at the Flower Mound Church of Christ when we moved chairs every Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night because we met in a school. We met at Coram Deo. And so in order to have worship for 6.5, 7 years almost, we had to move all of our chairs into the room. Then we had to move all of the chairs back into the hallways and into the classrooms every single time. Well, it's not that there was never enough room, but there was never enough room. You know, you couldn't hardly walk without stepping on people. And so once a year, again, not an official tradition, but I'm going to lobby to make it one. Once a year, we have youth camp here at this building. And the only place where the girls can sleep is in this part of the building. And so we move all the chairs out of this building. And it's a lot of moving chairs, very reminiscent. And then we go into the other building, and we get hard, plastic, awful chairs, just like at Coram Deo. And we sit in those for worship. And let me tell you, there are not enough seats. And you can't walk or breathe, right? We reenact in some small way what we used to do every single week at Coram Deo. Now, this is a lot of time talking about what tradition could be when it is done the right way or fully realized. There is retelling of your story. There is a reliving of the experience, and there is a reenacting. It's an engagement of the whole body, right? When tradition is done the right way, this is what it can be. Look at Exodus chapter 12. Look at Exodus chapter 12, because I didn't just make all of this up. Exodus chapter 12, you are at the very end of the 10 plagues. Moses has come through and had his showdown, well, God's showdown with Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. And in chapter 12, you've had the foretelling of the final 10th plague, and then you have, in chapter 12, this little break in the narrative to talk about a commandment that God's going to give his people. And in chapter 12, God gives them these commandments. We're just going to start in verse 1, and I don't think we'll read the entire chapter, but we'll read a chunk of it here. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first of the month. The first month of the year for you, tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household, and if a household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. And when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel, on the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. And they shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire. They shall eat it. So, time out right here. This is a command. And notice the command is, we're going to do this, like it's a continual, and it's going to be very clear later. This is something you're not going to do once, but you're going to continue to do these things, okay? You're going to find a lamb a year old, unspotted. You're all going to slaughter the lamb at the same time of night, which, what a vivid detail. Just saying, what did that sound like? Anyway, then you're going to take the blood of that lamb and a hyssop branch. You're going to paint your doorposts. And as is going to be mentioned, you're going to have this Passover happen, where if your doorpost is painted, God will pass over your house. And if your doorpost is not painted, God is going to take the life of your firstborn child. And that is that 10th plague. But notice, look in verse 10. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it. Here's how you're going to eat this stuff. With your belt fastened and your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand, you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. All right? And then he explains that the bit about the blood and passing over the houses with the blood. So you're going to put on your belt, you're going to get on your shoes, and you're going to hold your staff, and you're going to eat your food. Okay? Interesting details, important details. Here in a little bit, it's going to talk about how they need to remember this, right? This shall be in verse 14, a memorial day. So this is going to be a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. So this is not one thing that's going to happen one time. It's something you guys are going to do once a year on this special day. you're going to kill a lamb, paint its blood, roast it, have a feast, eat the lamb, and then you're going to eat it with your shoes on, your belt on, your staff in your hand. All right, then there's another piece of this. Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So he's going to go into a little bit more detail here. Go read this. It's not that long to read, but public reading is difficult, all right? So whenever I'm skipping through like this, go read this later tonight. It will take you 10 minutes. But if I read for 10 minutes, I will lose most of you. All right? You get what I'm saying here? So he's going to go on and give a little bit more detail about how to eat this unleavened bread, why they're doing the unleavened bread, okay? Then you skip over. I want you to skip over to verse 24. He says, "You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord has given you and he has promised, you shall keep this service." So again, this is not something meant to happen once. It's meant to happen over and over. This is a tradition. All right? Verse 26, "And when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' you shall say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses.' And the people bowed their heads and worshiped." So this is what's meant to happen. Now here's the cool part. We just had this whole break, this nearly 30-verse break in the story for commandments. Weird commandments. And then right after this, you have, in verse 29, the beginning of jumping back into the narrative. It says, "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up that night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, 'Go up, go out from among my people, both of you and the people of Israel. Go and serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone and bless me also.'" Which, the end of this story has Pharaoh asking for blessing from God. Cannot be overstated when you read this in its full context. Verse 33, "The Egyptians were urgent with the people and sent them out of the land in haste, for they said, 'We shall all be dead.' So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders." So why did they eat unleavened bread? Why was that a commandment? Because it's what they had to do. They had to leave before their bread could rise, because they were getting out of there, because the Egyptians wanted to get them out of there. Why might they need to eat this with their shoes on their feet, their staff in their hand, and their belt fastened? Because they were eating in haste. They were leaving. They were eating on the run. This is when this Passover, here's what happened. They had to get ready to go and to leave, and they didn't have time for their bread to rise. And so now to remember this, what are they going to do? They're going to reenact it. They're going to do the same thing again to remember this night when God did this thing. Secondly, they're going to retell it. Did you notice what happens? He gives specific instruction. When your children ask, what do you tell them? You retell the story. This is what happened that night. What, Dad, why do we have to put our shoes on when we eat? Let me tell you about this one night when God did this incredible thing. Retelling, reenacting, and reliving. Once a year, everyone in Israel slaughtered a lamb at midnight. That's a sound you're not going to forget. That's a smell, that roasted lamb. It's a smell you're not going to forget. There is a visceral reaction to Passover happening because you get to relive that experience, even if you weren't there. Tradition done the right way, believe it or not, is just tradition done the way God wants it to be done, with reenacting, retelling, and reliving of the experience. And when tradition is done this way, it is a life-giving force in the life of God's people. It is something that can bring tears to your eyes because you relive that moment that God did that thing. It is tradition, when done in this way, is something that can inspire growth and action in the life of a Christian, because you're reenacting that time when God did that incredible thing. Tradition, when it's fully realized, tradition, when it's done the way God intended, is a gift that's given to God's people by God. I want to revisit our story from a minute ago, because if this is what tradition is, then here's the really cool part. Anything can be a tradition. Anything. If tradition is just about reenacting, reliving, and retelling the story of God, or the story of how God worked in your world, then anything can be a tradition. Let's use our example of a bad tradition and cutting off the sides of the roast, okay? Mom, why do you cut off the ends of the roast? Let me tell you about your grandma. She didn't have enough money to feed everybody. She didn't have a pot big enough, but she invited people over to her house every Sunday. No matter what, whether she had enough or not, she invited people over and she served them. And sometimes she wouldn't eat. And because she didn't have a pot big enough and she couldn't make, we remember her sacrifice. We remember that time, and we reenact what she does, even when we invite too many people over and we might not have enough. It gives us a chance to retell the story of your grandma. Is that tradition? You bet. Is it traditionalism? Not even close. When tradition is done the way that God gave it to us to be done, it is a life-giving force in the life of God's people. This is meant to be a gift. I couldn't help but see the comparison between the way Jesus talked about the Sabbath and the way he might talk about tradition with us. When Jesus is pressed on working on the Sabbath, one of the things he says is the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I think in our frustration with traditionalism, you might hear Jesus say something similar. Tradition was made for you, not you for tradition. This is a gift God gave us to do great things in our life. And so here is what I believe, here's another example, one more example that I want to run through before we get to some so whats. There's a Jewish tradition called Hanukkah. Have you heard of this? It's actually, when you look at it, it's not a surprise that the Jews are good at meaningful tradition, right? I mean, God gave it to them, so we can learn a little bit from them about how to do this the right way. They have this tradition, celebration of Hanukkah. It's also called the Feast of Dedication, or the Festival of Lights. Those are all three names for the same holiday. At Hanukkah, the Jews will remember a time during the Maccabean revolt, during the Hasmonean, at the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. If you want to go look those words up later and read the story, incredible stories. You can find a lot of it in the historical writings of the Maccabees. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees have a lot of information on that. Anyway, at this time, the Greeks were taking over and oppressing God's people, the Jews. And I believe the straw that broke the camel's back was one of these Greek rulers sacrificed a pig in the temple. And I mean, the pigs are the symbol of everything unclean. This was not because he wanted pig that day, but to rub in the face of the Jews that Greece was in charge. And that inspired this revolt, the Maccabean revolt. It was led by a family, and it was spearheaded. One of the main guys was Judah Maccabee. And he led this revolt, and this tiny little nation, overthrew Greece, and they got him out of there. And when they went back into the temple to kick things off, they had to rededicate the temple. And so when they rededicated the temple, they took the lamp, which that lamp is actually in the old law. So there's a lamp in the temple. So they took that lamp and they lit the lamp, but they didn't have enough oil to continue the purification of the temple. But the oil in that lamp, as the story goes, lasted 8 days longer than it should have. They had enough oil for 1 day. It lasted 8 days. And so that was a miracle. That was them seeing God working. The fact that they overthrew Greece was they saw as God working through his people to rededicate the temple. And so the Jews, put their flag in that day and said, tradition, we know how to do this. So then they get together and they light the menorah, and it has 8 candles because the oil lasted them 8 days. So they reenact. They retell the story about how God allowed his people to overthrow and how they purified the temple, and God made the oil last much longer than it should have, right? And they relive that experience. I mean, a pig on the altar. 8 days longer. And we feast to celebrate what God did. That's a tradition, right? But if tradition is such a bad thing, obviously Jesus would have showed up and he'd have preached against it. He'd have said, hey, that Hanukkah thing, that's not scripture. That's just tradition. But what does Jesus actually do? Do you know? John chapter 10, Jesus shows up to Jerusalem for Hanukkah. It's not in the Bible. It's not God's word. But it is the life-giving version of tradition that God gave his people all the way back in Exodus chapter 12 to remember, to relive, I should say, to relive, to reenact, and to retell the story of what God is doing in the world. This is what tradition can be. It's meant to be a gift that God gave us to keep us close to him, to help us tell other people about him. And so the question, the end of the lesson, the question tonight is, how are you using this gift? Unfortunately, I indict myself by telling you my main family tradition is going to Sonic at Christmas. I think there's gratitude involved in that, and certainly all good things are from God. But how are you using this gift of tradition that God has given us? Let me ask, is worship a tradition for you? It's so funny to ask it this way as I was thinking through this. Let me ask this one. Is Bible class a tradition for your family? Is it a tradition for you? The way we typically ask, is Bible class a tradition or is it in the Bible? And we would say, yeah, Bible class is a tradition. You don't have to be there, might be the way someone would respond because, well, they didn't have Bible class in the Bible, right? But if tradition is this life-giving thing that God has gifted to his people, then the answer might be, yeah, Bible class is a tradition. We won't miss it. Why? Because you're retelling, you're reliving, and you're reenacting the things that God has done in your life and in the life of your family long before you were even a thought. Is worship a tradition for your family? Is Bible class a tradition? Are you using the gift that God has given you to instill faith in your family? Are you using the gift God has given you as an excuse to retell your story like Marcus did in his lesson only 1 week ago? Are you using the gift of tradition for outreach, for edification? Are you using it to instill faith and belief in your children and in your family and in your life? Are you receiving the gift and the life-giving gift that tradition can be? Or are we stuck in traditionalism? What's so beautiful about this is traditionalism, with no change except for how you think about it, can become a beautiful tradition. You cut the roast because you don't worry about it mindlessly. Traditionalism. You cut the roast and you remember why and you tell about it, suddenly it's life-giving. What an incredible gift God has given us. This is, I believe, part of what we need to say about tradition. As I was going through the lesson, I think we might have a part 2 on our hands. I don't know, Dad's rubbing off on me or I'm rubbing off on him. One of us can't finish in time. I'll let you guess which one that is. This is a gift, and I believe tradition is something that we as the church can use in a number of different ways. I think at another time we'll talk more about the specific ways we can use this gift to glorify God and spread the boundaries of the kingdom in the world. But tonight the question is, are you using this gift? And the other question, because we always offer an invitation, is, have you taken advantage of the greatest gift that God has given us in Jesus and the forgiveness that's found in his blood? And if not, man, let's show you what the Bible says about how to be in Christ and all the amazing gifts that has And if you need prayers of the church, this is a time for that as well. Let us know what you need, and we'll help you if you'll come forward while we stand and sing.